Okay, so we've got our image of the plastic chair here. And I'm going to make a quick drawing just to lay out the lines and shapes of this chair, be aware of my composition. So everything that we worked on last week, we want to do that now and kind of continually for the rest of the semester. All those things still apply. Thinking about our lines and shapes and their proximity to the outside edge of our frame. Sometimes, usually I would tape off the edges of my paper. I'm not going to do it right now just because I'm working my sketchbook. And this composition is just like a pretty central focus on the chair in the middle. It's not too dynamic of a composition. I know the cast shadow kind of runs off the edge down at the bottom. So I'm going to use my whole piece of paper and I'm working my sketchbook. So I'm not going to use the tape for right now. I know my drawing is hard to see at first. It's because I'm drawing as light as, not even as light as I can. I think if I wasn't doing a class demo, I would draw even lighter, but I want you to see what I'm doing. So I'm drawing a little bit extra dark, but I realize it's really difficult to see. So if anything, even if you can't see the lines that I'm making here, sorry, I don't know why my camera zooms out like that. Even if you can't see the lines that I'm making here, you can see the way that I'm making them. So I'm just kind of moving around, thinking about the outside contour of the whole chair. How does this back edge of the chair here relate to like this, the outside frame of each side? The top of the chair, how does that relate to the top of the picture? That's one way I can place an object in space. I've kind of made like a really simple outline here. This is more of like a drawing thing, a drawing class thing, but we could call this like an envelope shape. I'm using straight line construction to build this chair, which means I'm using mostly large straight lines instead of smaller, more focused, complicated ones. Straight lines are always going to be easier to draw than curved lines. Curves can be very complicated and subtle, but a straight line is this not just the shortest path between two things, but the most simple. So they're easier to get right. I know it's really hard to see. Also, look at the negative space within the chair, kind of from the back of the chair to the armrests. I just want to get it close enough. I don't have, it doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to have an idea of where I'm going, and I want the chair to make sense as a chair. Even if the chair that you paint doesn't end up looking exactly like this chair in front of us, as long as it looks like something you could sit on, we could all agree that it's a chair. That's good enough for me. Most of today is about pushing our knowledge of value and edge and starting to experiment with temperature and color. And a lot of times, a drawing like this drawing stage for me is kind of more about getting to know the composition rather than making like a really technical blueprint for my painting. That's partly what a drawing is for, but honestly, I end up erasing most of these lines. Drawing them is just like a way of getting to know where they're going to live, where they're going to land. It's like a practice round. I do the same thing with oil painting. I'll go in and kind of draw it all out with paint and then destroy most of it, and kind of start over. We can't really do that with watercolor, but that's kind of where my outlook towards drawing is coming from. Drawing it, destroying most of it, and redrawing it. And we can like slowly get to know the picture, going from general to specific. So, kind of related to Ross's inquiry earlier, like how much should we be drawing here? How specific should we get? That's going to be different for everyone. The thing I would navigate by is do what's useful for you. How much information do you need before you start painting? And if you're not sure about that, then let's just experiment with it. Let's see what happens. Try and get away with less if you can, is what I would lean towards. The less marks on your page, the better, because that will lead to less brush strokes. And I think being economic with your brush strokes is important. Again, that's kind of my opinion as a painter. For my bias is like, if you can do simple and good, that's that's really really cool.
Simple and good meaning simple and descriptive as well. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, that wasn't very clear. Like, yeah, simple but accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
Simple but accurate is hard. Because the world is complicated. We want to follow along perfectly everything that we it's harder to translate what we're seeing. It's easier to just copy it. But if you can translate it into simpler shapes but still be accurate to the perspective and to the form of the object and all the overlaps within it, that's it takes more discipline, but if you practice that now, if you practice that continually, it will get easier and easier, I promise. And it makes painting easier. If we had to paint this, just start at the top of the chair and just paint everything perfectly all the way down, that would be so difficult. I wouldn't know how to do that. I'm being pretty loose, drawing in the shadow shape on the ground because it's looser. It just has to attach to the chair legs really and be consistent with like the angle of the sun. As long as they're at a similar angle, they should be fine. What's cool about the cast shadow on the ground is, like I said earlier, it's descriptive of the object casting the shadow, which is the chair, and it tells us about the direction of the light source, which is where the sun is and why that angle of the shadow is doing what it's doing. But it also tells us about the shape of the ground. There's like little wobbly little uh varying shapes in there. I think those are really cool. I might even kind of push that as I work on it, especially those like stripes of the negative space of the seat of the chair here. Seeing those on the ground kind of morph and warp, describing the shape of the ground is really cool. So I'm going to be careful to when I get there. So let me hold this up. Can you see my drawing a little better? I'm gonna take my kneaded eraser. It's almost like lifting with this eraser, and I'm gonna just try and lighten everything until I really only have what feels like the most essential lines and shapes. Because my goal isn't to make a nice drawing of a chair. I want to make a painting of a chair. So this drawing is just uh like the most bare scaffolding for a painting possible. I think most of the shadow shape on the ground I'm going to erase because it's so loose and fluid, requires less planning. Things to look out for are the bottoms of the where the chair legs meet the ground. Think about how those relate to each other. Hopefully they make sense and have some kind of perspective. The way that they meet the ground and where, that too is descriptive of the ground plane itself. So I always say that in figure drawing, like that I have students who kind of ignore the feet sometimes when they're drawing a person, but the way that the feet connect to the ground, the way any object or person is like literally in touch with the ground tells us so much about the shape of the ground beneath them. And I think it has a lot to do with our sense of balance and stuff. We have to be, if we're unaware of the ground plane, we're going to feel kind of uneasy. It's like if a horizon is not quite straight, it's really going to stick out. So, something to be aware of. See if I can get a little bit closer here. Okay, so I think I'm gonna start painting. I haven't done this assignment in this class before, so this is the first. I'm excited. You can use any two pigments that you want. But that being said, I want you to think about the relationship between the two pigments. When I look at this chair, I see there's like a delicate balance between warm and cool. So let me share my screen real quick, just so we're all looking at the same thing. Um, the balance between warm and cool is, I think, I'm guessing, but I think it's coming from the blue sky and the brownish sand. So there's a balance between like blue and like this dark, earthy, like brownish yellow in here. So I think I'm gonna do like brown, or sorry, ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. Now we could use a full palette to paint this whole thing, but the what I want to do here is just, it's kind of like training wheels. I want to keep it really simple before we get into the full extended palette. I want you to just see how it feels navigating between just two colors. And I think warm and cool is a great way to do that. If you want to do neon pink and green, you're welcome to do that. But I think ultramarine blue and yellow ochre is like probably the most efficient and simplest way for us to do this. That's what I'm going to be using. I think if you have those pigments, I highly recommend you using those actually. Now that I think about it, when I first was thinking about the project, I was thinking let's use any two colors, but I think yellow ochre and ultramarine blue will work the best. I don't want to overcomplicate things. So what we're going to do here on our palette is we're going to have a blue side of the palette. We're going to have a yellow, brownish yellow, so yellow ochre. If you have raw umber, that's can sometimes be a substitute for yellow ochre. That works too. We'll have a yellow side of the palette too, and then we'll kind of see how they can interact in the middle. So I'm just pushing that on my around on my palette right now. When we mix warm colors and cool colors, we get gray. Just as a oversimplification, big general blanket statement, mixing warm and cool together gives you gray. Gray can be useful. I'm going to start off with just a watered down ultramarine blue, super light, lots of water. And just like I did last week, I'm going to map out my shadow shapes. I'm going to erase my lines a little bit more. I hope there's not too much ambient noise coming from the background where I am. I'm sharing a wall with a bar, and they're just pretty intense over there right now. So I hope that's not coming through. Kind of drawn to this cast shadow, like where the arm of the chair curves up towards the back. There's a lot of contrast there, a lot of gesture, a lot of like movement in the brushstroke. I talked a little bit about that last week. Okay, so this is like super light. I'm gonna add a little bit more blue. So with our limited palette, it's not gonna look exactly like the photo. Our goal isn't to paint the exact color that we're seeing. What we want to paint is the relationships. So don't paint the colors, paint the relationships. that spectrum between warm and cool. We want to be aware of that as much as we're aware of what the color is and what we could name the color. So as this
Sean, can you make your screen any bigger? I don't know if it's just me, but I've
like
got,
zooming in
no,
on it?
not that. The actual picture. I used to have a full screen and now I have a little square of you.
Oh, that is on your end, I think. So if you go to the top right corner of your Zoom window, it says view, and go to, you click
I'm
on,
on speaker view.
you're on speaker view. It should be just me then.
It is, but it's just a little square and I got a lot of black around you. Does anybody else see that?
Yes, that's we all see.
Um, huh. Let me move stuff around and see if it changes. So I removed the spotlight and now I'm gonna replace it again. Did that help?
No.
Can you try stretching the window around maybe?
I've got you on full screen because I have two monitors and it's still like, I don't know, 2 by 5.
And more than
It's,
one person's experiencing that?
yeah, we're all seeing it. That got bigger a little bit, but
Huh. Um,
Are you starting with a gray that you made by mixing the two colors?
I'm starting with just a light blue. It might look gray, but it's really watered down ultramarine blue. As we
And
mix,
that's in the lightest, is that, it's hard to see what you're painting. Are you painting the lightest area of the chair?
I'm starting with the shadows
Oh, you're doing that for the shadow.
towards the top left where the arm kind of goes up towards the back of the chair. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on with my Zoom camera though, so. So Jane wrote in the chat, if you double click, it should enlarge it. Let me spotlight it again.
So we saw you big, but then when we go to your other camera, it goes small.
I'm working on a phone and I've got a big image. I don't know if that makes any difference.
Still the same now?
Yes.
yes,
So weird. I don't know why it would just change too. Hmm.
Okay, this has nothing to do with anything except for I'm in Oregon and it's snowing right now and it looks like feathers are falling from the sky. It's so big.
That's awesome. Oh, this looks different now. Does it still
That's better.
looks the same on
That's
your end?
yeah, that got a little
bigger.
But now I'm further away.
That looks good.
So is the window still small? I'm more zoomed in now, and that might go away on its own again, but I hope it doesn't.
That's much better.
Okay. I don't know what it is. Before I was chasing my camera around, I just wanted to point out earlier this shadow going down, like we could call it the shoulder of the chair, maybe coming down towards that flat plane of the armrest. It's getting much, much brighter. Those armrests are catching a ton of light, probably the brightest part of the whole chair, other than like the front of the seat, maybe. So it's a quick but smooth transition from dark to light. So I used water to kind of, I put the brushstroke down, added some water, and then used the paper towel to pull some of that pigment out and just try and get a smooth transition. So that's like a wet into wet transition. Even though the clear water is what it was transitioning towards, it's important to be aware of that kind of edge for that kind of shadow. So I'm gonna go down the other side too. So there's like a side facing plane of the inside of the chair. It's a little bit darker. And then the upward facing plane, like it's facing up towards the sky. So that's getting hit with more light. So it's brighter. What's tricky is most of these transitions on this chair are soft. Most of the edges are smooth, which makes it challenging. So I'm gonna lighten this all again. Even across that whole top of the chair there, it kind of rolls back towards the light. If the edge you put down is too sharp, clean your brush, get some water in the bristles, and go in and add some water like I'm doing now, and you can soften your edge and have a paper towel or a rag handy and pull that out. Lift out some of that pigment and just try and get that softer edge. Now this like zoomed in part of the camera is working when it didn't before. So I don't know what is going on, but I'm glad it's working. So again, I'm just using some like watered down ultramarine blue to map out the shadow shapes. Just like we did with the monochromatic compositions. And then we can push the values and the temperature a little bit more later. Right here, the arm rest on our left side overlaps with the shadow cast on this back of the chair there. So I'm going to make sure I let that shape come forward. So going back to what Ross was saying about outlining things, instead of outlining the edge of this chair, the edge of this armrest as it comes forward, because it's getting hit with light. We have a line on the left side. There's like a little lip to that edge. But on the right side, it's just getting hit with light. We don't need to outline that. We can define where this armrest ends by painting the dark shape behind it. So the armrest at that corner right there is white. We can't really paint a white thing because we're using the white of the paper. So we paint the darker shape next to it. And I'll try and keep these shadows pretty light because there is a lot of variance on the chair. Just within the shadows itself, there's dark and light within the shadows. So we want to give ourselves room on the value scale for later on. I talked about gesture and your brushstroke a little bit last week. Even from right here, from what for the front of the chair, I know there's some glare on it. It's kind of hard to see from this angle. But going from here to here, instead of just coloring it in kind of really safe all the way across, think about how you can start at one end and really like embody the movement of that shape, even though the chair is not moving and your painting isn't moving. The thing that moves through that is the path of our eye. So think about the shape of your brushstroke. See if you can get that in one fell swoop. Tiny little light shape back here. If you're able to get that in, I think it'll help create some depth kind of right here under the armrest towards the back left leg. I got a little bit dark on some of these, so I'm using the paper towel to lift some stuff out. I'm gonna let this dry for a second. You can see just again, the really light, really watered down ultramarine blue is just kind of ghosted in here. Really soft. Part of me wants to just leave it without the cast shadow on the ground. It's kind of cool like this. Has anyone already painted the cast shadow on the ground? It's okay if you have. I'm tempted to
No.
just ignore it. So did someone say yeah?
I said no.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'll leave it up to you. I'm tempted to ignore it and let this chair just kind of float on the page. I think it's kind of interesting like that. I don't know. I could go either way. I'm gonna erase my pencil lines and see how that looks. Does anyone have any strong opinions about ignoring that shadow? I think the composition is stronger without it. So something I'll ask myself when I'm making any kind of composition is, I could paint this element, like I could paint it well and realistically, but does it help? I was painting up on the mountain today, and kind of like it's an overwhelming amount of information to take in. If you could paint all of it, but you kind of have to decide like, well, which shapes will help the composition and which shapes will hurt it. I think this painting will be stronger without that shadow on the ground. Okay, so I think my painting's mostly dry. So I'm going to start experimenting. So one place I'm noticing where the shadows get definitely warmer rather than cooler is on the insides of the legs of the chairs here, because the sand is reflecting up into it. The sand is the warmer light source here. So there's, even though they're in shadow, there's reflected light coming up into it. The chairs is pretty much the same color all around. So it's a really good way to see into the different ways the indirect light sources are kind of reflecting light back up into the shadows. So I'm going to grab some yellow ochre here and water it down. And I'm going to add it to the inside of the chair leg here. Just looking at the screen, I'm like disappointed in my camera a little bit. I wish you could see into the temperatures a little bit better, but I'm just going to go for it and do it. So if you're following along with me, notice how that kind of adding in that temperature shift is going to give it a slightly different feel. Also a little bit up here. Rest. There's also some warmth on the back of the chair here, but it's even more subtle. So I'm adding even more water still. It also gets pretty light too. So I don't want to overload this area. I'm pushing in a little bit of that warmth. And then I noticed down here where it kind of bends into the seat of the chair, it gets a little bit darker and cooler. So just anticipating that. Also just realized I totally forgot about this cast shadow from the armrest here. Something to notice here, it's okay if you just pass over it. This is a little bit more complicated. So if you feel pretty comfortable in doing this, you can follow along. I'm trying to be aware of this space right here, this negative space. I'm gonna keep the sand as like the white of the paper, again, just because I like how it's kind of affecting composition. So this cast shadow I'm about to do, I'd love to just do it in one fluid stroke, but these stripes kind of interrupt it. We could see the sand between them. So I'm gonna try and show that in the brush strokes, and it might not work out, but I'm gonna go for it. If you've been in my class before, that's something that happens. I'll say, I'm going to try this. It might be a failure, so maybe watch me do it first and then we'll learn to avoid it. But yeah, I'm going to go for it. So I'm trying to get this cast shadow on the seat of the chair from the armrest. Without going over those gaps in the seat. And I kind of just connected them. I'm just going to connect them. So we started with some blue. We added some yellow. Now I'm going to mix the two together. So one area where I see them coming together is this inside plane of the armrest up here. Going from this corner up towards the back of the chair. Seems like a darker gray or in between right there. Maybe across the front of the seat here. Maybe a couple other areas. But I'm going to take some yellow ochre and some water and some ultramarine blue. This is going to give us like a gray green. If it feels too much, feels like too much yellow, add some blue. If it feels like too much blue, add a little bit of yellow. But this is going to be a darker and more gray color compared to the ones we've been using so far. I just added some blue along the top of that shadow, wet into wet. Just where it starts to turn towards the light, it gets a little bit darker and a little bit more blue. So I try to push that a little bit. The music from downstairs is shaking the whole room that I'm in. So I don't know if that's coming through, but that's what's happening. It's not an earthquake. I'm gonna take this darker greenish color. It's probably more ultramarine blue than yellow. And I'm gonna really carefully go along this like harder edge line along the armrest and along the seat back of the chair. More crisp shadow, just like a sharper plane change. So experiment with that balance between warm and cool, between the yellow ochre and the ultramarine blue. See how it looks and feels to get like an even mix between the two. And then maybe in some areas you push one more than the other. This area here towards the top left corner, this inside plane, that shadow towards the inside of that curve, and this outside smaller, sharper edge, they all kind of mix in with a form shadow right here. I know there's a lot of technical terms, but long story short, they all kind of blend together right there. So that could be something to experiment with too. I lifted a little bit and then I kind of moved some of the pigment around. So don't be afraid to like finesse the pigment and move it around, adding water, taking away water, whatever you have to do. Just see how that feels and how the two pigments, the warm and the cool, are informing each other. And try to be aware of like the ultramarine blue, just on its own as a pigment, is much darker in value. So even though I'm mixing the two sort of evenly to get this darker greenish gray, if I want to get really super dark, I could always just add more ultramarine blue. But I'm not quite there yet. I'm still kind of in the mid tones. So I've been adding in some yellow ochre, slowly starting to get darker. Now I'm kind of pulling back towards the blue again. Still pretty dark, but thinking about which of these shadows are actually a little bit cooler. A lot of what I'm referencing here is referring to like the color wheel in general, which I didn't really go over. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth when we do our color charts. But if I say a color is cooler, I mean that it's more towards blue, not like cooler, like I think it's cool. And then warmer would be more towards right between yellow and red, or like an orange. Orange is the complement of blue, it's the opposite of blue. So we kind of split the difference between yellow and red. So for this assignment, we just have the yellow ochre, which is a warmer pigment. It's not the warmest, but we can definitely play it off of the blue as a warm. So for now, for this shadow, like back here where the seat back is kind of meeting up with the seat, I'm gonna go more blue. It's definitely cooler and it's darker, especially this cast shadow coming across the seat. Got a little bit of yellow ochre in there, but I'm pushing the ultramarine blue for extra dark. And since it's a cast shadow, it has a pretty crisp edge. So this is more of a wet into dry. Up here, this was all softer, so we did more wet into wet for softer edges. This wet into dry I'm being really sharp with. Leaving a little bit of an edge here. Remember, I want to define that armrest by painting the dark shape next to it. Although I brought it up a little too far. I think I made it all way too dark. I think I got too excited. So I lifted some of that out with the paper towel. I'll go in with a clean brush and just kind of spread this pigment. And it has a pretty soft, smooth gradation going up from there. It's a tough painting. I've painted these with oil before. I've never done a watercolor of the plastic chair. It's hard. I'm gonna let this dry before I start to really overwork it. I'm gonna let it all dry. I'm gonna take a step back, take a deep breath. Again, like I know I'm prone to overworking stuff, so it's if you're like me, it's good to zoom out for a second, look at the big picture. Even as I say that, I can't help myself. I'm going to push this a little bit darker, and then I'm going to walk away. So I'm trying to soften some of these edges by lifting some pigment out with a damp paper towel, and I'm definitely reaching the limits of my sketchbook paper here. If I was on the arches, it would hold up a little bit more. But it's still kind of working as far as softening those. We'll see what happens if I try to paint over it. I want to push this shadow in here a little bit more. So now that I'm mostly dried up here, it's a cooler, darker shadow, so I'm going to lean this more towards blue, but there's still some yellow in it. And it's a smooth transition going up, so I'm going to add some water to a clean brush and just try and pull this up in this direction for a smooth gradient. I think it's a little closer. I still have a ways to go with that, so that might take another round. So I'm getting out a smaller brush. This is that brush pen. It has water in it. I'm going to use it just because it's the smallest, tightest brush I have here. If you have a smaller brush, you can use that. I'm going to just use this like a regular brush and dip it into the pigment just like I normally would with any other brush. But I want to get these sharp lines on the edges going. A little bit sharper than before. So this one here kind of starts out thin and gets a little bit thicker. So that's easier to start thin and get thicker than to start thicker and get thin. So I'm going to start my brush stroke up here and pull it down in this direction. It's not like a rule. You don't have to do any brush stroke any certain way, but I do want you to be aware of what works best for you and your brush. Every brush stroke matters. So now I'm pushing the darkest darks a little darker. No matter how I say it, that's always going to sound very silly. But an important part of the painting. This really sharp shape really softens up as it kind of moves up and out. So it starts out wet on dry, super sharp, and then kind of ends really soft. So I'm gonna add some water, might add some pigment as it turns a little bit more lighter and blue towards the top. One thing I've pretty much ignored is this edge over here. The chair kind of comes back here for the seat and kind of moves back and curves all this way. All of that's getting hit with direct light. Same with like the tops of these armrests. I don't have to go in and outline them. I'm just kind of letting them be on their own. I call that a lost edge. If there's a bright shape with another bright shape behind it, I like letting the viewer kind of fill in the gaps of that on their own, and I don't have to spell it out. outlining everything all the time. I think the idea that this is a plastic chair getting hit with sunlight still comes through without that, and it might even be more interesting without spelling out all those details. So I'll keep coming back to that throughout the semester, but that's what I mean when I talk about a lost edge. Everyone doing okay out there? Hope it's a good silence. No one's ripped up their painting yet. If you have,
Shane, I got a question.
yes.
So you said you're going to forego the sand, and I'm wondering how to get those really white, unpainted areas to have an outline. See, like the top of the chair and the arms there. I see the left side arm has an under shadow there, sort of from the lip.
Yeah,
Just wondering how can you do sort of negative painting without putting any paint down for
that's
the
a great
sand?
question. I'm kind of choosing to ignore it, really. We could go in with like pencil and indicate that there's a line there. That would be one way to do it. So far I'm just kind of letting it be, because like when I step back, this is where it's tricky. It gets subjective and it's up to you. If you step back and think like, okay, I really think it would be stronger to know where the edge of that armrest is, then
Right.
a way to add that in would be more paint, maybe a pencil line, maybe painting the darkness behind it. What I think, and this is like a personal subjective opinion, but like I don't know that the painting needs that either. I think I'm okay leaving it as is, and that is totally 100% up to you. I
Okay.
think adding in the background, that sand, is one way to do it for sure. We could do that and kind of make this more of a full composition. You could go in and just paint a little bit like around it, just to show where the edge of that armrest is.
Okay, with a really light tone.
You could,
Um,
yeah, a really light, thin
okay.
wash to kind of go all the way around it. Yeah, maybe I'll do that.
Okay.
Maybe I'll let this dry and then I'll do a really light wash all the way around it. Let me wait a sec.
Because otherwise, if I leave that right arm unpainted, or to show that the depth of it or the size of it, it looks like it's a really skinny arm over there.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
I just
yeah.
want to define that edge.
No, that's a great question. Great idea. Let's I'm gonna let this dry and then I'll do a really light wash all around it, and I'll leave that white of the armrest there
Okay.
more defined. And let's see how that looks.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So you asked how we were doing with our painting. I'm ashamed to admit I've not begun painting. I've just kind of gotten drawing down. I'm really
okay.
slow and perfectionist. Is there a way, like if in our next class we're going to work from a reference photo that you provide us in class, could you send it to us a little? I know you've been in France and that whole thing is got to be nutty for you to be also teaching a class. But if we could get the reference photo ahead and maybe kind of work on a drawing before we start class, do a little homework in that regard, that would be super helpful, at least for me.
Absolutely. I usually try to do that.
Okay.
I didn't this time, but no, I'm gonna try to do that as much as I can, especially as we get into more complicated
Sweet. Thank you.
things.
I appreciate
Yeah, yeah. And I appreciate you caring enough to make a perfect drawing.
it.
That's great.
Still not there yet.
And I'm supposed to be letting this dry so I can go in and mess around with the background, but I'm just kind of moving around, dropping some yellow into a couple different areas. And I just like how it interacts with the blue. So it could be a fun thing to experiment with. I had that this morning. I was doing a painting of these mountains, and it was so, everything was just so blue. The sky was blue, the mountains on the shadows were blue. And I needed to make something a little bit bluer, but I was kind of maxed out on my blue. It couldn't get any cooler really. So to make it more blue, I added a little bit of warmth on the adjacent shape, and that kind of turns the blue on a little bit more, and it becomes supercharged. So it's all about context. So experiment with how that yellow and that blue are playing off of one another. Okay, so I want to see what happens. This is a little experiment here. You don't have to follow along. I'm taking this larger flat brush. This is, I think, an inch. Yeah, 1 inch flat. And I'm loading it up with lots of yellow ochre pigment. And I'm going to just paint around it and see if I can help define this armrest over here a little bit better. This is going to change the feeling of the painting though. But now I can better define those light shapes. So again, totally changes how the painting feels, but I've got a little bit more chair to work with now. I may have liked it more before. Might be a little too yellow. A little bit of white at the base of this leg here. And then also here now I want to help define where the light is hitting the chair. I think if I was trying to represent the sand perfectly, I would have added a little bit of blue to desaturate some of the yellow, but I'm just kind of using this yellow as a sort of an abstract element in the background just to push that light shape on the armrest there. I'm kind of painting through some areas a little bit. So remember, it's just an exercise. Don't worry about making a masterpiece. I'm just kind of moving some paint around now, experimenting with some transparency, painting right through some areas. Maybe I'll lift some of this out now too.
So Shane, I have a question. I think I might try the shadow of the chair.
Yeah,
And so I'm just kind of curious how you would recommend. I don't want that to become too dark and too dominant.
that's a good
How would
question.
you do that? Like mostly ultramarine and a bit of, you want it gray, a darker gray, but I don't know. What do you think?
No, that's a great question. So, and this gets into that realm of, we want to paint realistically, but we want to make a good painting. And sometimes those two don't overlap. So
Yeah.
maybe the more realistic answer would be to make that cast shadow super dark. But, right, we don't want to take away from that subtlety we've built up in the other areas of the chair. So what I would do would be maybe start off with just something similar to the cast shadow across the seat of the chair, which is like a
Mm.
watered down ultramarine blue. And we don't have to get darker right from the start. We can always make things darker too. So like if it's not dark enough, we can always push it. But I
Yeah.
would do maybe start off with just the light ultramarine and see where that gets us. Because it'll at least put the chair on some kind of a ground plane,
Yeah.
which I think would be good.
Yeah.
I might even experiment a little bit with a pencil and push some of these lines around. It's kind of turning into this abstract thing here. Which usually doesn't happen. Usually I stick to my intentions, but this is a new project for me. So if you want to mess around with pencil lines or anything like that, we can try that. I have these Conte pencils that are super dark. I use them for life drawing.
Yeah, those are awesome.
Yeah, they're really powerful. Super black lines. So I might mess around with this a little bit. Lots of what I've been doing the last 10 minutes or so is just kind of messing around with stuff, experimenting. So don't be shy messing around with different materials or different ways of working. This is just an experiment just to get us going. Dipping our toes into the world of color here. Light versus dark. I think as far as homework for this week, let's just take this chair wherever you want it to go. So I took it to a weird place here. That's not required at all, but um, think about how you want to finish this painting. Most of what I do in this class is help you start paintings. I want to make you feel comfortable and confident in starting a painting. Only you can really finish a painting, though. Only you can finish your painting. At least I think that's how I think. Especially as we go further in the semester, we get into some more personal projects. I'm always here to guide you with whatever you might be thinking about doing with your painting, but it can get really exciting to get a painting to a point where it could really go a lot of different ways. So it's fun, I think. I think it's fun to experiment with that uncertainty. These pencil lines I'm adding, I really don't want to do, I don't want to overwork this and cover it with contour lines. I want every brush stroke, every move that I make just to be helpful or be useful and have purpose. So I don't want it, it's not that the right way to do this is to overthink every single thing. That's not what I mean, but I just always want to really pay attention to what I'm doing and why. But I think it's time for me to be done with this chair before I start wrecking it.